We have a very, very distinguished panel and what we hope will be an engaging program. And it will be most engaging because you all will have questions toward the end. I want to take a moment and introduce an extraordinary woman who will be moderating today's panel. Trudy Rubin is the Foreign Affairs columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer and a member of the Inquirer's editorial board. In 2019, Trudy received the Overseas Press Club of America's Flora Lewis Award for Best Commentary in International Affairs. In 2017 and 2001, she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Commentary. She is the author of Willful Blindness, the Bush Administration, and Iraq. She has special expertise on the Middle East, South Asia, and Russia. In recent years, she has written from China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Egypt, Tunisia, Lebanon, Israel, and the West Bank, and many other countries. Perhaps most relevant to today's discussion, Trudy visited Afghanistan under the Taliban in 1999 and many times since then. So I want to thank all four of you for joining us today, and note that Professor Osman has to dash off 5 minutes before the program should end at 4:55 to keep teaching at Temple University and sharing her wisdom and expertise with students there. And on that note, Trudy, the floor is yours, and we will begin our program.
Thank you so much, LaShawn. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be sitting back here live and looking at real human beings. So thank you all for coming out today, because after a year and a half of Zoom, it is a real pleasure to see your faces. And it couldn't be a more timely moment to be speaking about Afghanistan. All of you saw the scenes of chaos with the last withdrawal and the frightening scenes of people trying to get out who couldn't. We've just seen 9/11, and I think all of us are wondering how this withdrawal will affect both the people in Afghanistan, America's foreign policy going forward, and the political fortunes of Joe Biden, not to ignore, which is equally, if not more important, the personal fortunes of the women and human rights activists left behind. So it is my great pleasure to introduce, from left to right, Wazhmah Osman, who is an assistant professor in Temple University's Department of Media Studies and Production. Wazhmah was born in Kabul. She has done extensive field research there and has been working to help people get out and also to welcome refugees here. John Gans, sitting in the middle, is the director, of communications and research at Perry Worldhouse. He has extensive experience at the Pentagon, including being the chief speechwriter for former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter and other leaders in the department. And he is the author of White House Warriors: How the National Security Council Transformed the American Way of War. And Meg Guilford is a Penn Vice-Provost Postdoctoral Fellow in residence at Perry Worldhouse. Her research agenda, which is broad, is focused on political violence, conflict processes, and US foreign policy. And she was on a civilian deployment to Iraq and worked for the Institute for Defense Analyses and the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. So all in all, a panel that can handle all aspects of what has happened in Afghanistan and what we are going to focus on mainly, which is what is likely to happen in the future. So let me just ask Wazhmah to start by looking at the internal consequences of what we all recently witnessed.
Thank you, Trudy. I want to just start by saying it's an honor to share the stage with people who've dedicated and invested many years in genuinely trying to help the people of Afghanistan. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a few insights from my book that was recently published, Television and the Afghan Culture Wars, brought to you by foreigners, warlords, and activists. And I want to focus on how we got here in this crisis situation in Afghanistan, in order to then talk about and open up the conversation to what are some possible ways, some insights for the future. So I'll start by talking about how, historically speaking, from Rudyard Kipling to Winston Churchill, for many years, Afghanistan has been portrayed in Western discourse, both Afghanistan and the people, as backwards and desolate. And so words that were actually used were, unchanging, traditional, tribal, despotic, incapable of democracy and modernizing. And some of these conversations we hear again today. And then after 9/11, some of these stereotypical and racist portrayals became worse with the Taliban when they came to power as a result of their draconian interpretation of Islam, as well as their misogynist policies and so forth. But as Trudy mentioned, I was born in Kabul, and so I've made many trips there back and forth. I have family there, and so both personally and with my academic training and research, I knew that there's a long history of social movements and activism in Afghanistan, and that long history is also an active present. So in contemporary times, post 9/11, there's been incredible movements for human rights and cultural contestations around all kinds of things. And that was the focus of my book, was to redirect the global discourse back to Afghans, which I was able to do via ethnographic methods of interviewing people. And so I'll talk about briefly, since we have very little time, about some of the conclusions. And so one of my conclusions, which is based on a number of case studies, is that the international interventions in Afghanistan in the last 20 years, and I should mention that they're US-led interventions, because the US in many ways, both militarily and in terms of development aid, led the rest of the nations that were involved. So overall, it's resulted in both where we're at currently, which is the collapse of society, but also it yielded many positive and fruitful development projects and policies, which I can talk about as well. So there was many incredible projects that I witnessed that had an impact in many ways, and also many problematic ones. So another conclusion, and this is the final conclusion I'll talk about, since we don't have much time, is also a policy recommendation. And that is to point to this idea of how, or I guess I should say, it's a colonial myth that some countries are a blank canvas. And so we have to acknowledge the fact that currently the US is economically, politically, militarily in a very dominant position, and also very much so in control of politics in Afghanistan. And that what happened when I interviewed people, especially officials and international consultants and people like that, is that this gives technocrats who are part of the interventions godlike powers, and that these godlike powers to entirely recreate and remake countries is very dangerous, because oftentimes it doesn't take into account the consideration of people on the ground. And so one of my conclusions is that it's time to start centering the voices of Afghan human rights workers, professionals, journalists, intellectuals, and many others who I describe in the book. They have been risking their lives continuously on a daily basis to fight for social justice and also to lay the foundations of democracy. And that those are the people that I think will hopefully, provide some routes out of the current crisis situation that we're in, and that the result of focusing on some of these technocratic programs that are top down is that the policies are also short-sighted, and those policies have resulted in a number of policy blunders, and they've empowered the very people who are currently in power, which is warlord types, and currently we have the Taliban. And that was as a result of direct and indirect support and funding of ultra-right and anti-democratic people and regimes and militias. And so focusing back on the people who actually are aligned with our, claimed agenda and goals for human rights and democracy is the best route to move forward. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wazhmah. And over to John.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be with you, and thanks. This is a great panel to be a part of. And just in general, I think we can all agree that life feels a little more normal when we're gathering here in Harry World House in the late afternoon light to talk about foreign affairs that don't include the word COVID. So it's kind of an exciting time. And it's very good to be with you. I'll keep my thoughts pretty brief. I think I'm here, to sort of add a little context of what we can expect from the US government in its approach to the Afghanistan's future. And I think that if you sort of look at the last 6 to 8 weeks and I think the real conflagration of frustration and anger and disappointment that people felt around the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think if you have to sort of work through and sort of distill that down to sort of credible voices and try to get to what the basic frustration was. And I think if you take the partisans out of the mix, like diehard Republicans who would criticize Joe Biden for anything and diehard Democrats who would love him for anything, and you take out the sort of hawks who wanted to be in Afghanistan forever, and I think over 20 years, we've all met somebody who thinks the United States should have stayed in Afghanistan forever. And those of us who spent time in the Pentagon met a lot of those people. And then if you take out the people who wanted to walk away from Afghanistan, and some of them who never wanted to be there in the first place, I think what you sort of found was a broad acceptance that America probably needed to change course in Afghanistan and probably needed to end its engagement there in some way. But I think those people were profoundly upset with the sort of incompetent withdrawal and how it went down. And I think that sort of myth of competence is kind of amazing that people still have it about American foreign policy after the last 20 years, because there have been many blunders. I wrote about a few in my book. Trudy's written about them 2 or 3 times a week for the better part of 20 years. And I think that is the reality of American foreign policy, is that it tries to do big, hard things sometimes, and it doesn't have the world's greatest track record of doing those things. Unfortunately, a lot of people in Afghanistan had to endure that for much of the last generation. But I think as you think about what the United States can do in Afghanistan and will do in Afghanistan, I think that damaging the myth of competence of the Biden team is one that is really sort of disorienting for a lot of people and very disheartening for many people who perhaps had great hopes for what America was going to do in the post-Trump era. I think a lot of people got in the habit of blaming one person for much of what went wrong over the last 4 years. And I think that's an old habit to break. But I think that is a good thing to get away from. And I think if you do, you can really look at the last 4 to 8 weeks and realize there's a few real trends that exist. One of them is the US government is in worse shape than I think anybody can appreciate. The performance on display, even removing Joe Biden from the equation, was not great. You had intelligence that was, sound, but probably not communicated effectively to the policymakers and the customers who needed to sort of know it. You had military making some pretty strong decisions and having their voices and saying there's some concerns here, but those didn't break through into a sound policy. I think you had diplomats that didn't, State Department that is in very bad shape after 4 years of being battered and 4 years of people leaving the State Department, and didn't have the competency to really execute on the visas and the other things needed to get people out safely. And then you had this sort of new era of American foreign policy, which includes a lot of people from the outside trying to get and right the ship. And I think what you found is this isn't really a great way to do things. And I think that what I think everybody realized, and everybody around the world who got frustrated, everybody in the United States who got frustrated, is, this is no way to run an empire, and certainly no way to really lead the world. And so if the Biden team is going to do that and reassert American leadership, is it going to try and help shape Afghanistan's future? It's going to have to improve on those trends and improve those things. And it will take considerable work at a time when the United States has a lot of challenges ahead. And so I think anybody who wants the United States to do X, Y, or Z in the near term has to bake into their recommendations some of the challenges that we've seen over the last 6 to 8 weeks. And that will help us, I think, come out of this in a better place and help perhaps come up with some good ideas to help people in Afghanistan who are about to go into some tough days. And I think that is our probably only hope for being able to meet some of the other challenges the country faces. Thank you.
Meg. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Meg Guliford, and it is my pleasure to be here today, particularly as a proud Penn alum, to be back home and actually on this stage. So this is actually just such an honor to be here. My comments are actually going to be a nice segue from what Wazhmah and John have said, and I really want to move away from the bilateral US-Afghanistan relationship and the focus on Afghanistan to look more global. And right now we have a situation which is akin to the dog that caught the car. The Taliban have seized control of the central government, but what do they do with it now? Controlling a central government is very different than controlling territory and engaging in governance locally and regionally, which the Taliban has done prior. Now they are the Taliban-led central government. So what do they do with that? What's most important to understand, I think, is that this government gets to decide what type of international relationship it wants to engage in with its potential international partners. The US is not and has not been the only game in town. There are other major powers that may not rise to the level of our traditional great powers that are in play here. You have Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and China involved, as well as the numerous neighbors that Afghanistan has. Much of the language used by Western powers thus far by their leaders in talking about the situation in Afghanistan has been rather conditions-based, waiting to see if there's a deeds and words alignment or a disconnect from the Taliban-led government. So in their eventual rhetoric and in their enacted policies. But in the meantime, Afghanistan faces an economic and humanitarian crisis. People are starving. The government has little control over its own resources that are found throughout the world. The West has largely adopted a policy of either hesitation or withdrawal. Most recently, the US, UK, Germany, the World Bank, NATO, and IMF have suspended aid programs in the midst of a humanitarian crisis. The US has frozen over $10 billion in Afghanistan's assets. But in the meantime, there's this gap where China has a first mover advantage in this respect because they stepped up on August 15th and provided over $30 million in aid, including health and food supplies that included 3 million COVID vaccines to the people of Afghanistan. So they are meeting needs. Pakistan also has stepped up in profound fashion and shipped both food and health supplies. So in this, you have this gap provides like a double-edged sword in many respects. For many years, for over a decade, the United States has wanted countries such as Russia and China to step up and do more in Afghanistan. Now they are. And so the issue remains, if the United States is okay with a potential loss of prestige and influence in the country based on that these new relationships or strengthened relationships over time. So it's not as if the international community has completely turned its back on Afghanistan. Just yesterday, there was a high-level UN ministerial in which the international community pledged over $1.2 billion in humanitarian and development aid alone. These are first steps. A lot of work has to be done in Afghanistan by its government and with its international partners. But right now, we're all in a holding pattern, waiting to see what's next. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Meg. And that actually leads right into some questions I'd like to ask all of you. And if you could be, unfortunately, brief in your answers, because we're running a little bit behind and we want to get to questions from the audience. But let me just start with Wazhmah. Do you feel that there is anything the international community can do that would impel the Taliban to loosen up what seems to be the same kind of strictures that they want to place on women as they placed on women when they were in power before?
Yeah, that's a great question, one I've been thinking about a lot. And so the Taliban are, as you said, placing many of the same strictures, not allowing women in higher positions of government and civil society. They just recently, tried to stop many of the women's national sports teams and so forth and so on. And these are all dangerous policies that echo back to when they were originally in power. And so to your question of what can the international community do, I think it's a tough question because it's like they have to figure out a balance of between what Meg said. On the one hand, the US and some other donor countries are holding the coffers and closing them from getting access to aid. But then on the other hand, we don't want the Taliban to entirely collapse because that can create another civil war and more war. And the people have been so traumatized by 40 years of war. And so I think there has to be a balance between the two. And then from there, I think that, they can move forward maybe in some kind of coalition government.
John, let me follow up on that. Do you think that the Biden government is through with Afghanistan, that it can really turn its back on the country? Or do you think that in order for there to be any kind of coherent regional approach, the Biden administration will get drawn back in? And maybe you could also mention whether you think the withdrawal defines the Biden foreign policy to come.
Okay, I'll be as brief as I can. But I think the short answer to the first part is, I think the Biden administration would very much like to not have to talk about, defend Afghanistan policy in the years to come. I mean, I think one thing is very clear is that, I think foreign policy, people who study foreign policy like to talk about trends across many wars. Afghanistan's always been a little different for the basic reason that we saw this weekend, right? Which is that it was always about 9/11, or at least it was born in 9/11. And that was a very specific thing for American people. And so it's always been a politically very, very, very complex foreign policy thing. It's different than China. It's different than Iraq. It's different than a lot of things. Afghanistan's always been particularly sticky in that way. So I think that the Biden administration would like to probably just be able to move on and talk about China and talk about these other things. But I think that it will prove, I think two things. The Biden administration hasn't proven particularly lucky on Afghanistan yet. And generally speaking, that luck probably will hold. The second thing is it's going to be sticky. I just think it's the kind of thing that will stick around in the debates and the conversations, in part because I think it does help understand a little of Biden's foreign policy opinion. I think if you sort of know Joe Biden and follow him from his, he campaigned for the Senate opposed to the Vietnam War. I mean, this is a person who's been around for a while and has gone through really the two sort of most complicated foreign policy moments in American history. But I think if you look at Joe Biden in 1972 when he's running, I think if you look at Joe Biden in the 90s when he was really opposed to the Gulf War, but really viscerally for American leadership in the Balkans. And then you look at him after 9/11 and in his conversations about Afghanistan since then, I think what you see is a person who genuinely does believe that America can only do so much without people on the ground who want to participate and want the same thing. And I think that's a pretty clear thing that he, I think, said explicitly. We can't fight for you. You have to fight. And I think, there are a lot of people who took offense to that, and I think rightly so. I think there were a lot of people in Afghanistan who were fighting for a better future. But I do think that that is probably a pretty clear defining line of where he'll invest American time and American resources in his own credibility in the months and years ahead, which is if you're willing to fight and willing to stand up and fight for what we believe in, we'll stand with you. Now, that's a pretty distinctly different thing than American foreign policy has long been, which is that we will fight for what we value and what we think is in our interest regardless. And so I think that's probably something, and probably why a lot of people in Europe, a lot of people in Asia probably sat up and said, what does this mean for me? And I think there are some people probably in Taiwan, there's people in parts of Eastern Europe that are probably like, well, what does that actually mean for the Baltics? What does that mean for Taiwan? What does that mean for all these things? What does it mean for the South China Sea? So I think that's what we will see. But I think crises have a way of revealing presidents. And this one, I think, did reveal a lot about Joe Biden that a lot of people didn't appreciate going in. And I think it will continue to do so in the years ahead.
Meg, let me pick up right from there. Supposedly, we went into Afghanistan to deal with a terrorist threat. And we know that the Taliban has never separated from Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda affiliates. And there is intelligence estimates, if we could have any faith in those, that say Al-Qaeda will be reconstituted in 1 to 2 years. Do you think that the United States will face a terrorist threat again from Afghanistan, a threat so potent that we would have to do something about it? And is over the horizon approach that Biden has adopted remotely realistic?
This is a question that, of course, many have on their minds. And I think with respect to the threat to the United States homeland, I don't think that's actually there's a really credible threat coming out of Afghanistan. I think that's more a threat to the Afghan civilians as well as to the region and region overall. The over the horizon efforts actually raise a large number of issues in it by themselves. We had tens of thousands of US and NATO troops on the ground for many years. And when we used drone strikes, there were still so many civilian casualties. And now that we've removed all of those forces and lost situational awareness, I worry that those results will be much more damaging overall. The New York Times just released a disturbing article about the last known missile strike on the 29th that killed Zamari Ahmadi, who we've come to know was an aid worker. And the disconnect between the rhetoric of US officials and what the New York Times found on the ground is problematic. Were those explosives in his trunk, or were they bottles of water that he had picked up in the course of his job? US officials have confirmed that they did not know a lot about his identity when that strike from an MQ-9 Reaper killed him. So that is highly problematic from my perspective. That is highly problematic for many reasons. And overall, some of the language that I find most disturbing and have found disturbing for the last 20 years is the only when we talk about civilian casualties. The current situation is the US government has said there were only 3 civilians killed, whereas the family and local leaders have said there were 10, including 7 children. The idea of it being only 3 is problematic and only shows us further evidence that the United States continues to discount the value of brown bodies, both internationally and domestically.
Thanks very much. I think we're going to move on to questions now. And while any of you who want to ask questions line up for microphones, which are, okay.
Touchless microphones for you to use. You can just walk
Okay.
up and speak.
If you want to ask questions, line up there. And in the meantime, I'm going to take some questions that were posed by the audience. The first one by Mary C. $1.2 billion in aid to be distributed, managed by the Taliban government, question mark. This does not seem like a sound plan. How will it really impact citizens versus the friends of the Taliban? Some of this was raised before. Let me start with Wazhmah, and Meg, if you want to add. I think the operative questions are 2. One, does the Taliban have any infrastructure, and can it be trusted to deliver the aid? And 2, will they let aid groups operate unfettered and deliver the aid where it should go, especially if that aid is destined in part for minorities or for people who the Taliban may consider not in their corner. Wazhmah.
I think this dovetails well with your question earlier, which is how can we, the international community and the US, pressure the Taliban? And this is exactly how. They need the money, that the people need food, there's inflation, the cost of everything has gone up. We've all who've spent time in Afghanistan have been in touch with people on a regular basis who are in dire situations, and that's why they're trying to get out. And so that's one way of putting pressure, is to make it so that there's a transitional government with them that then leads to a coalition government that brings in other groups that are not hardliners, and then open it up to elections again. Because ultimately the people of Afghanistan are, just like most people anywhere, are not going to want a government that has taken over by force, by brute force, right? So I think, that could be good leverage.
Did you want to add something, Meg?
I think the answer to that question, from my perspective, is we don't know, because we don't know how they're going to govern yet. We do know that the initial aid flights from the World Food Program that just happened in the last 24 to 48 hours have gotten in and have been distributed. All we can go on right now is what they've said, and they said they would allow this. But right now, the impetus is getting the aid to the people who need it as quickly as possible. And it's not just the Taliban-led government that's the issue. There are many other groups in the country trying to disrupt what is happening, because we know from the bombing that took place outside of the airport, that was not the Taliban. That was not the Taliban government. That was ISIS-K, who are no friends to the Taliban. So you have groups that are working against the government's efforts and any efforts that the government might be undertaking to try to govern. So it's not just an issue with the Taliban.
Thanks very much. And now I'm going to turn to the audience.
Hi, let's see if, can people hear me? Yes?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so conversations about American security interests, talk about the local region, and then some of the time there's at the end a PS that says, oh, and by the way, climate change is impacting or even a partial driver of this problem. despite the fact that we know, already that a significant fraction of the sort of active conflict zones in the world, I might say even a majority, are actually being impacted or driven by climate change. So with respect to Afghanistan and also like other places where the US aligns its forces against jihadism, Middle East, Sahel, how do we actually constructively talk about and like implement policy taking into account the impact of climate change?
Do you want to address that to any particular panelists?
Any of you that has thoughts?
To dig in there. I think, when we, in 10, 20, 30 years, I think when we look back on Afghanistan and the US sort of misadventure there, I think one of the things we will realize is that for at least the past 10 years, we were probably trying to build a nation that was being sort of slowly decimated by climate change, among other things. And so what was a hard job was probably an impossible job in those situations. And I think what you're seeing with some of the famine and some of the sort of agricultural issues the country's facing right now suggests that that was probably one of the reasons this was so hard. If it, and I think we'll find that in the years ahead, especially when we look back on this. In terms of making sort of the United States think about climate change in a sort of more compelling way, I mean, I think one of the challenges that the United States has somewhat gotten into is that we tend to talk about climate change two different ways, right? We talk to the American people about opportunities, right? Let's get off of, let's put solar panels on your house. You can get a job building, renewable electronic plants, things along those lines. We talk about it in that way. We tend to think about it as in terms of like crises, in terms of existential crises. But I think we don't actually join them, and we don't specifically say, if you want to think about the China relationship, here is how climate change is going to affect it, right? If you want to think about the Middle East, here is how climate change is going to change it. And I think that is one thing where we have traditionally, I think one of the sort of real challenges with government, and one of the sort of problems I think you saw unfold in Afghanistan, is that the bureaucracy kind of does its thing, right? And that's what sort of happened over the past 6-8 weeks, where the Defense Department said, hey, you want us out? We can get out. We can get out better than anybody in the world. And they got out. And the State Department said, great, you want us to get these visas ready? We'll be ready in 6 to 18 months, right? Those are two bureaucratic sort of cultural things that existed. But very few of these organizations are built to think about climate change and price it into their policies. You see some of that in terms of force structure at the Department of Defense. You see some of that with some of the climate work the State Department does, but you don't see it in terms of saying, if America's interests are X, how do you pursue them in a world that's fundamentally different because of climate change? And we'll get more different every 5 to 10 years. And so I think it's a sort of a failure of imagination. I think it's a failure of bureaucracy, and I think it's a failure of specialization, which, much like COVID, we have a bunch of people who, over the last 20 years, got into terrorism, but didn't think about all the other things that were affecting terrorism, or got into China, but didn't think about all the things that would affect China, like public health and environment. And so I think those are things that we need to prove upon, and they start with getting better people to work in government. So hopefully people like you and others will go into government and improve upon it. But it's going to be a rough few years, because I can tell you the people at the top don't think like that. And I think that's pretty clear from what we just experienced in Afghanistan and what you see on other fronts.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you all so much. My name is Hannah. I have a question for Professor. I was wondering, with the mass exodus, how you expect professionals to hold enough sway or authority. I was wondering if we're looking at a multi-generational process here to kind of regain what the more activist things we were mentioning going on in Afghanistan coming to fruition in government, and if you think maybe one way to speed up the process would be leveraging aid.
Could you just repeat I couldn't quite follow.
Oh, sure. I'm so sorry. So I was wondering, with the mass exodus of people from Afghanistan, how you kind of expect professionals to hold sway or authority in the emerging Taliban government. And I was wondering if we're looking at kind of a multi-generational process to gain back some more of the professional progress that you had mentioned.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's something that some people have called brain drain. With every wave of war, we lose a lot of talent, creativity, intellectuals who leave and are not able to do their jobs anymore. But there's also a number of people that have stayed. So I think both tapping into the diaspora, people who've been involved in these big questions about how to move the country forward and build a progressive democratic society, with the diaspora and people who are there is a really good approach. And I give a ton of examples in my research, including in my book. But one quick example is a woman by the name of Fatma Gilani, and she was one of the negotiators with the Taliban, and she has a position of power and has a good amount of clout in the country. So people like her are able to negotiate complexities and could be really useful if the US tapped into them, but they don't, oftentimes. So that's one solution.
Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, we are running short of time, and there are a lot of terrific questions here about China, about bin Laden, but Wazhmah has to go to get to her class teaching at Temple. So I have to make way for her to leave now. And perhaps we can get in another quick question afterwards. Thank you so much, Wazhmah. I'm just going to take a question from online, which is about China's approach to Afghanistan now. Does China care about the shared border? And how much does China's persecution of the Uyghurs matter to the Taliban? And I would just add, the Chinese have invested broadly to forward their own interests, building roads to, for example, Afghanistan's copper mines, hire only Chinese workers. So, Meg, I'd like to ask you, what do you think are China's goals and interests in Afghanistan? And to put it bluntly, do the Taliban care about the Uyghurs, or are they likely to make a deal with China to crack down on rebel groups that are associated with the Uyghurs?
That is something about which I have little understanding in terms of the relationship between the China's international efforts with respect to their Uyghur population. I will say I doubt that is really on the Taliban's mind right now, and I doubt it would be a deal breaker in any sort of fashion. Right now, recent reports have talked about China really caring about tamping down on violence spilling over into borders. The border between China and Afghanistan is very small, but they don't want regional violence. China does not want that to happen. But also, and this hasn't come up yet, but the rare earths that are present in Afghanistan, is particularly lithium. China probably wants to maintain the best relationship possible to be able to build the infrastructure to be able to harvest those rare earths. That being said, we're just not sure yet, but they have had a relationship for a while. It's been ongoing and they've worked well together. I doubt that will change moving forward. They will find shared benefit in how they move forward, and much of that will be on tamping down regional violence and increased investment into Afghanistan to get rare earths and other such resources that will better China's economic position.
Right, and we have time for one more. John, let me ask you this. One of the online questions wants to know about the implications of the US withdrawal to democracies as they dwindle in South Asia. with India being the only neighbor of Afghanistan that has oh dear, a sort of stable secular democracy, more or less. So how will this foreign policy, this move by the Biden administration shape American foreign policy in the region? And who do you think in the region is most worried about it?
It's a great question, and I think I think I've had a pretty strong track record over the last 6 to 8 weeks, because every time everybody wants to say this says X or this says Y, I've always just said we'll see, because I think, you know, with Afghanistan and with U.S. foreign policy, that's a pretty safe answer to sort of say. I mean, I think there's a trend right now in South Asia, in the United States, in just about everywhere against democracy. I mean, I think that is what you're seeing. I think Freedom House report showed a pretty staggering review of, I think 70% of countries have seen some democratic backsliding in the last few years. And I think the COVID pandemic has been not been a great harbinger for democracy. I think that I think that the democratic game has always been the long game. And I think that despite everybody's sort of beliefs and dreams over the last 30 years that we could do this quick, this is a slow process. I think, you know, it's dependent a lot on who's elected, unfortunately. And so I think, you know, whether you have Modi in India, whether you have Donald Trump here, whether you have some of the actors, I think what you will find, and I think what we will see, is that climate change is going to make it very hard on any kind of government. And I think South Asia is going to have a very rough climate change relative to other places on Earth. And so I think that what you will find is that democracies are going to have a very hard time holding on. And I think climate change is probably going to be a bigger driver of that than American foreign policy in Afghanistan. But I think that what we need to do, partly based on the previous question, is if you want to push for democracy, you're going to have to figure out for ways democracy can respond to the challenges people face, whether it's the Taliban trying to respond to a famine, whether it's Modi trying to respond to a pandemic, whether it is, you know, events in Pakistan or events even here. And so those are, this is a moment when democracy needs to figure that out. And I think Joe Biden has an interest in promoting that, but that also starts with proving that democracy can handle its business here at home. So I think probably we'll see on democracy. And I think for me personally, I'll hope to see that we can sort of, democracy's best days are still ahead.
Thank you so much, both of you, Meg and John. And now we are going to have a final word.
Thank you.
From LaShawn Jefferson.
Could we actually start by giving a round of applause to our audience, I mean, to our panel, to our audience. So of course, thank you again to Meg, to John, to Trudy, to Wazhmah, who had to leave early for, as you can see, a very exciting discussion. And thanks to all of you for turning out today and sticking with us through your masks and through the breathing and trying to hear us through our masks. It's a new endeavor for us, but we're very committed to having in-person programming, so the next time will be even better. In fact, we hope to see you next week on September 26th, when, as a part of Penn Climate Week, we will be hosting Michael Mann, Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science at Penn State, for a provocative discussion on the importance of both the importance of both urgency and agency in the battle to avert a climate crisis. Since the issue of Uyghurs came up in relation to what's happening in Afghanistan, you should also know that on October 12th, we're going to be holding a World Today that focuses on what's happening to the Uyghurs in China. And I just wanted to say that one of the many takeaways from this panel, and I took a couple of notes as everyone was talking, was both the myth of competence, the myth of a blank slate, which Wazhmah mentioned, meaning that Afghanistan is actually not a blank slate, has like a long history, and all countries that go there should kind of remember that. And the truth of other powers, which is that whatever the US or other countries don't do in Afghanistan, there are plenty of other countries who will be willing to step up and play a role in Afghanistan's future, and we should all be kind of acutely aware of that. You can always, this takes some juggling, but you can always access a recording of this conversation on YouTube. and can find out all about our other upcoming events by joining our mailing list and following us on social media for up-to-date information on critical contemporary global affairs and public policy issues. We'll drop links to those online for those of you who are online still in the chat function. And until the next time we see you, please be well, and thanks for turning out.